Good morning. How's everyone doing this morning? We are ready to roll this morning. Let me know you're here. I see a number of you already on. Say hi. Great to see you all again for our Friday morning Devos. We have a good morning planned today. You're going to get a little sneak preview of Sunday, of what's coming Sunday. So don't tell anyone. This is all top secret. But we're going to look at a little bit at our passage. Good morning, Karen. Good to see you last night. Sally, good to see you. Hey, before we all jump in, I want to wait till there's everyone's kind of clocked in, but I want to just reflect a little bit on last night. Our worship night is a great night. Last night, JJ led us in worship with Lucia. It was a beautiful night. Everyone was connecting. Just a great night of prayer. Don Reed did a great job just leading us through the theme of strengthen last night, as we're strengthened against opposition to fulfill the purpose God has for us. And it's just a great night of prayer. But JJ led. Yeah, Karen, it was so sweet to sit behind your group and see all you ladies just praying and calling out to the Lord, just praying for strength. As I was there with my daughter, so it was fun to do that. But so it was JJ's technically his last corporate leading of us in worship as our worship leader. He'll transition to his new role after this, but he's taking a 9-week sabbatical. He's been here for a little over 8 years and hasn't had a sabbatical. So he's going to have some time to rest and retreat a little bit, to pray, just to kind of seek things for the future and what that looks like. But I want to encourage you. One of the things we did last night is fill out a card for JJ. Everyone had the opportunity to just write a little note of encouragement for him. And if you weren't there or weren't able to do that, I'm going to put up, here's JJ's email address. It's also on our website. If you can't write this down or forget it, you can just search him up on our website, our staff link, and click on his picture and it'll connect you to his email. But in the next 8-9 weeks, he's going to have some time to pray, retreat, refresh, reflect, and start just seeking God for this new direction and this new role he's going to be in. But this would be a great time for you just to shoot him a note of encouragement. Share with him how much you love him, how much he's encouraged you in your life. Just a short note, and even maybe a prayer that you'll pray for him while he's on his sabbatical. So jot that down. Take some time to just shoot a little note to him. Don't underestimate how much it means to just hear some words of encouragement. I'll be quite honest with you. Oftentimes, even though they are the minority, the critics tend to have the loudest voices in almost every organization, and the church is no different. And so we can often hear too frequently a lot of criticisms. And as one person said, for every criticism, we need about 8 to 10 positive encouraging words to kind of outweigh it. So even a 50-50 dose of encouragement and criticism, a person typically walks away dwelling more on the criticism than they do the encouragement. So if we can flood him with some encouragement, I think that's a sweet way to send him out on this time. So take a moment, write him a little note, and encourage him as he heads out. So we're going to take a look at just 2 verses today from, actually, this is part of our Sunday message. I'm going to cover this whole passage from verse 11 to the end of it. 3 things that Paul wants us to remember as the church, as he defines who we are. And part of that is remembering who we've been or where we were, and not just in our own personal past, but even going back further than that. So we're going to take a look at this together this morning, just these 2 verses, and reflect a little bit on that, of what I think is important, really for us personally, but even more so for us as a church. It has huge corporate implications for how we act as a church and what we're called to as a church. And that's what Paul is getting into in this portion of Ephesians. He's talked about our salvation and the work God's done, that overarching plan in chapters 1, the prayer, and then into the first half of chapter 2 of personally how we're reconciled with God vertically, how we were once dead and objects of his wrath, and now through Christ we've been made alive and are objects of his favor and blessing. And now he's going to talk about how that plays out horizontally and what that means for us as a people, and that salvation for us corporately. So he says this, he says, so then, remember that at one time you were Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcised by those called the circumcised, which is done in the flesh by human hands. So this is weird language. We don't talk like this nowadays. So let me just explain a little bit what Paul's talking about. He's using what was a common division of humanity back in Paul's day of Jew and Gentile. So the Jewish people were one category, and everyone else, anyone outside the Jewish people, were considered Gentiles. This is terminology that the Jewish people would have used, and even others would have used when interacting in those circumstances. So he's using that term here. The idea of uncircumcised and circumcised, those were nicknames they would refer to each other as. You see that in the Old Testament often as well. That anyone that's uncircumcised was technically a slang term for a Gentile or a non-Jewish person, and one who is circumcised was considered a Jewish person because that was the sign of the Abrahamic covenant. So you see that here as we go through that. So Paul's just saying, hey, remember that at one time you were Gentiles in the flesh, meaning as he preaches and teaches these things to the church in Ephesus, he's telling them that you were, in a sense, one way you could see this is God's people were the Jewish people, and Gentiles were those who were apart from God's covenant or apart from the family of God. Now, someone could become a Jew or a proselyte and join that, and they were within it. But if you were a Gentile, the term Gentile often referred to someone who was outside the covenant of God. They weren't worshiping the God of Israel. They were worshiping the God of their nation. And it's so important to understand this because it's so different than today. In Paul's day and in the Old Testament days, every nation essentially had their own God. There was national gods. And if you were associated with a certain nation, you were associated with their God, and vice versa. So if you switched nations or you moved, you either set aside your old God and adopted the new God of that new nation, or you kind of lived as a foreigner or as an odd person in that new nation. And so that's why, as God was revealing himself and how people even went to battle back then, they saw victories in war as their God demonstrating his superior over other people's God. So they were very much tied into military success, and the domination of a given nation was how it was often seen back then. So we see that here. So Paul's saying to this church in Ephesus, it's now God's people, part of God's people, saying, hey, you once weren't part of God's people, meaning you were outside the promises and the covenants of God. And he says, what was the result of that? He says, at that time you were without Christ, excluded from the citizenship of Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of promise, without hope and without God in the world. So this is really important. And Paul's not reaching back even too far for them, obviously, because historically, the good news of Jesus Christ and Christianity was brand new. So these people, their past was very fresh to them. They had just transitioned from their past of worshiping all these different gods, and Ephesus had a whole pantheon of gods. There's 50 different temples in Ephesus for all the different ways you could worship. And so these people were realizing, wow, that's who we once were. We were separated from Christ, or the Messiah, who is being proclaimed through the Old Testament in preparation for Israel's deliverance. and they were foreigners to these covenants and promises. They didn't have hope, and they were without God in the world. And I think we often can slip into the same general spot, especially in America, where Christianity has been part of our nation for so long. We just assume that's the norm, and we've always been around it. Many of us maybe grew up in Christian homes or have generations of Christianity in our family. Not everyone, but many do. And oftentimes churches can be characterized by that, by people who have been in the church for a very long time. And we forget our history, and it affects us. We forget that one time, if you were to go back and read, and many of you have, if you read the Old Testament, we tend to read it with improper eyes. We read it by always putting ourselves in the hero circle, or on the good side. We always associate ourselves with the people of Israel, because we say, yeah, we believe in this God now. But the truth is, historically, we are not the people of Israel. Most of us are Gentiles. We're not Jewish. The majority of people in our church are not Jewish. I know we have a couple, not very many, but we'll talk about that a little bit. But the majority of us are Gentiles. So if you go back historically, our ancestors, in terms of the Old Testament, were the Gentile nations that surrounded Israel. They were the Babylonians, the Romans, the Assyrians, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, and on and on and on. All of these foreign Gentile nations were considered enemies of God's people. They wanted their gods to be seen as dominant, and they would have taken out the Israelites at any moment that they had. And so if you want to go back and read the Old Testament and remember who we were, the fact is, we were those other people. We were people from nations who did not worship the true God. And in fact, because Israel was a fairly small nation and they stayed very inward, many of us, had we been born back then, just think about this. Had you been born in your ancestral history, if God had said, you know what, Chad, you're going to be born in 1000 BC or 500 BC, if that was God's sovereign choice, then I would have been raised in a nation that worshiped some foreign God. I would have probably never been exposed to the true God of Israel, never known those covenants, never known the promises, never known that the coming of Jesus was part of that. I would have never heard those truths, and neither would you have. And that should make us think very differently when we think about who we are as the church. That, as far as I know, none of us had any choice in when we were born. Only God's sovereignty has determined that. And he could have easily had us born at a time where we would have grown up, lived, and died, never hearing about the true God, living in a nation that worshiped a totally different God. And how difficult it would have been. Oftentimes we think, oh, but if I would have heard about him, I would have totally chosen that God. We can think about that in our personal arrogance, that it's just our own wisdom that has chosen this, and it's others' rebellion that hasn't. But the fact is, back then, if you were to change gods, if you were to leave the God that your nation worshiped, you would be turning your back on your whole culture, your nationality, and ultimately your family. You would be stripping yourself of everything that's typically considered important in your identity in your life to make that choice. And very few people do that. It's very easy for us to be a Christian here in America because we're a hodgepodge of a lot of religions, but predominantly we're Christian. So it's very easy to do that. And so that's why I think we have a lot of people that just choose it out of convenience. But Paul's saying, if we're going to be effective and really realize who we are, we must remember our history. I love how George Santayana said it. He says, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. He was a Spanish-born American author in the early 1900s. Winston Churchill made this quote somewhat famous when he quoted it Later on, he slightly changed it, but he was quoting it from this particular author who wrote it. And I think Paul is kind of reminding us of the truth within this quote when he says, remember, we need to remember our past, that we were separated. And one of the reasons we were so separated is because Israel was so disobedient. They were called to be a light to the nations, and instead they became an extremely isolated and internally focused people. And as we're going to see even in this passage, instead of God's covenant leading them to love and reach out and be a light to the nations, it caused them to be very hostile toward the nations, towards anyone who is different from them, not realizing their own history. Because if you look at Israel's history, you realize that Abraham actually was a pagan. He was a Gentile at one time. He was called out of a pagan nation. God reveals that in Acts chapter 7, that's shared and elsewhere, that he was called out of a pagan nation, and God made a covenant with him to bring and be a blessing to all the nations. So one of the problems that Israel had in fulfilling their purpose was they forgot who they were. They thought they were special in themselves because of themselves in what God was doing in them, and they didn't realize that it was a humble grace that God was giving them to fulfill that to the world. In fact, listen to what God said to them in Deuteronomy chapter 9. God said this, he said, when the Lord your God drives them out before you, this is when he's calling them just before they're heading into the promised land, the second generation. And he says, when the Lord your God drives them out before you, do not say to yourself, the Lord brought me in to take possession of this land because of my righteousness. Instead, the Lord will drive out these nations before you because of their wickedness. You are not going to take possession of their land because of your righteousness or your integrity. Instead, the Lord your God will drive out these nations before you because of their wickedness, in order to fulfill the promise he swore to your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's where he's going back to the Abrahamic covenant. He says, understand that the Lord your God is giving you this good land. Let's roll it up. To possess, because understand that the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stiff-necked people. So here's the problem here, is God is basically doing in this passage what Paul is calling us to do as a church today, is to remember who we once were. And the Israelites forgot that. And as a result, they started to see themselves as so special and better than the rest of the world that they failed to fulfill their purpose. God said this through the prophet Isaiah. He says, it is not enough for you to be my servant, raising up the tribes of Jacob and restoring the protected ones of Israel, saying it's not enough for you to do that. That's part of it. Just as we as a church should be saying, it's not enough that as leaders in the church or as Christians that we just raise up and we take care and we restore the people within the church. It's not enough for that. That's not all that we're called to. He says, I will also make you a light for the nations to be my salvation to the ends of the earth. So it's so important that we remember our history and remember in God's sovereign kindness that we could have been born as Gentiles at any time. And we could have been born at a time where we were physically totally separated from any knowledge of God and not have the gift of grace that we have heard. And that should cause us to think differently about people in our world today, even people in our city, people in our neighborhood. You know, there are people still in America who can grow up in a family where they never hear the gospel. They hang around with people who had never interacted with the gospel. And they're just in pockets of our world that seem so broken and damaged that oftentimes we Christians who love to have this nice little safe protected life, we never will dip into those worlds or those places in our city or people in those neighborhoods. And so they can be actually totally isolated from the gospel, just like many of the nations were back in Israel's time. And our arrogance that keeps us all about protecting ourselves and clinging to this world, and forgetting that that was our past as well, that we actually have more in common with people in those situations than we don't have in common. And that there's not all these different races and groups within the world. There's really only one race. It's the fallen human race, and we're all part of that. We are simply redeemed and saved by grace and called into a new race, so to speak, by God that he is making. And he's taking all these blended people and making them all into one perfect human race. And so I just want to encourage you this morning that there are people in your life who are probably really difficult for you to engage, difficult for you to connect with or to understand, or even to feel comfortable engaging. And it's important that we can sit and snub our noses or look down at people that do things that we don't think we would ever do. But we don't have to look that far back in history to realize our ancestors did some of those same things. Our ancestors were huge enemies of God. They were sworn enemies of God. They sought to destroy God's people throughout time. And that's our ancestry, all of ours if we're not Jewish. And if we're Jewish, that's also ours, because Abraham was not Jewish. He was a pagan that God called out, just like he's doing the Gentiles now. So it's important to remember who we were, that that's our history as well. And God has always done his best work working with the most grotesque and ugly of human beings and changing them into the people he has wanted them to be. So give some thought to that this morning. Appreciate being here with you all. Hang in there. This quarantine is getting long. It's getting old. We're continuing to wrestle with ways we can connect people going forward. We are going to kind of re-up our commitment to some home church sites in the weeks to come, especially as we go into fall, and really try to find some safe, strategic, and gospel-centered sites and ways for you to connect and be strengthened in your faith during a very difficult season. So love you all. Hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks for tuning in this morning. Hey, Veronica. Just saw that. Good to see you, girl. From way down in Laredo, tuning in. Make sure you say hi to Israel for me. Good to see you. I'm going to tune out, but you guys have a wonderful week. Good to see y'all. Thank you too, Sally. Good to see you this morning as well. Hope you're doing well. Miss seeing your smiling, bubbly face. I hope that we can do that again here soon.